Okay, we're still in 11, I'm going to call this R, of GGS, and I'm still on Diocletian because it's important to understand the transition that Diocletian, how do you want to call it, is associated with if he didn't create it himself, which seems like he did. In order to understand Constantine and the whole rise of Catholicism, you have to understand what Diocletian did. The Catholics, of course, will claim that they were the original Christianity. They're not. They're the original apostasy in a way. But everybody was apostate, so this isn't a rant against Catholicism. It is really an attempt to show what Paul is saying in these verses. And he's saying we're all bad. Okay? So it's just a question of how the political dominance of Christianity came to be. And Paul is basically telling you that story here by the words he picks. Okay? In other words, here at the other end, Paul is showing a 49, which means Christianity is in the tank. But by the same token, he's saying that God is going to make that work out. That's what this part of the verse is. Erguntas. Alright, see, I can't make it work out well, but this is what that clause in verse 11 means. So he's telling you two stories. He's saying, yes, Christianity is in the tank, but at the same time, God is going to use it to rescue Christians. Because you got two kinds of Christians at the time. You got the few, very few, who are actually learning Bible. And in those days, in order to learn Bible, you did have to associate yourself with the religion that was developing in order to be able to even see a Bible. Okay? But what you ideally did is you were a washerwoman or a cook or a monk, and you just quietly learned it, doing whatever duties you had to do in order to be close to the text. It was progressively hard to get the text. Alright? And that was one of the reasons why this thing with Diocletian and what became the so-called Great Persecution of 303 was so important. The attempt was to destroy all Christians, all text. Satan was trying to get rid of, the text, because the interest in Christianity was growing in the West and also in the East. And here we're going to see the eastern side of the problem. So he wanted to get rid of it. And because he already had succeeded in making us apostate, but he hadn't succeeded in getting rid of the text. And whatever you want to say about Catholicism, it was just one of many heresies going on at that time. Alright, Catholicism was really just getting started. And the whole structure of Catholicism is basically a legacy of Diocletian. The absolutism of it, the hierarchy of it, all that is really borrowed from the time that it grew. Because Christianity initially was just a bunch of houses where people went to hear scripture. There was no such thing as a religious hierarchy. That didn't develop until after the apostles died in 96. The last one being John, exiled on Patmos. And then there was this big scramble for power in the wake of no apostles. And then you had all those phony people claiming that they were the apostles that succeeded the apostles appointed by the apostles, and that was not the doctrine to start with. You're only an apostle if Christ appointed you, the risen Christ appointed you. That's 1 Corinthians 1:15. So all this thing that I've been doing is to try to trace the change and to show how Paul predicted it back in 56. Okay, or what we're going to call 56 by his own Anno Domini accounting. Alright, it might be 58 by our standards, but it might really be 56. That's one of the questions I have to resolve. In any event, in my ongoing attempt to get some kind of clarity about Diocletian, I ran across this site at ccel.org, which is now in the left window, which I'm highlighting, which is the Shaft Herzog, right here where you see it's now highlighted in, you see it's now underlined in blue, okay, on and off. That's where this is coming from, and that's page 254 of it, which I just downloaded. You can download it in PDF for like $3. But if you're new to ccel.org, you can download it for free. And it's, it's worth many times that price. You can also buy it at Amazon. Anyway, this is their entry on Diocletian. And again, unfortunately, I really find this annoying. When the people who are writing the history are Christian, they have a Christian slant. When the people who are writing the information are anti-Christian, they have an anti-Christian slant. So it's real hard to get objective information, okay? If you want to read Gibbon, he hated the Christians, and him, like Will Durant, he slants the information to make Christianity look worse than it was. It was plenty bad, but he just exalts in anything that makes Christianity look even worse. All right, the same thing is true of Will Durant's section on Rome, and especially the rise of Constantine and all that. And the truth is going to be in the middle. Okay, was Constantine really a Christian? Yeah, I think he was. Was he a devout Christian that really had that vision, like Eusebius said? No, probably not. Okay, or else it was invented out of political expediency. And all what the real story is the story that Paul is telling right here, is that there was a unification going on politically because the empire was breaking up. Diocletian was very earnest about trying to make that unification go. And it's a real pistol to figure out what kind of personality Diocletian actually was. He had to have been charismatic to some extent, okay, in order to get power. Whether he got power legally or illegally, I'm not sure. There's a story that he killed the father-in-law of Numerian for covering up Numerian's death, and then here Schaff is saying Numerian was murdered. I don't believe that at all. Okay, the stories that are there about Numerian don't support that, and it certainly wouldn't have been Afer, his father-in-law, because Numerian had married Afer's daughter, and that was actually orchestrated by Carus, who was the dad of Numerian. Okay, maybe even before Carus. It might have been Probus even, I don't remember. But the point is that Afer did not kill his own son-in-law. That for sure didn't happen. Maybe somebody else did, but Afer covered it up. For sure, Afer covered up the death of his son-in-law. That is definite. But there's another story about Diocletian that he accused Afer and thrust him through with a sword right in front of all the Roman, legions assembled there to have a trial about it. Okay? I find that hard to believe. Okay? I really do. So who invented the story that Diocletian had that kind of a temperament? All right, he might have really had it. He might have really done it. I don't know. But a guy that had that kind of temperament is following Gallienus' policy that Gallienus set up in 259 of toleration for the Christians, and that was in the West, in Gaul and Spain and Britain. Okay? Diocletian comes across to me as being a very astute guy, and if he orchestrated the murder of Numerian, orchestrated being elected by the soldiers, and since he was only 39, there's a lot to argue that he did, he was back and forth on things. People are not universally and uniformly nice or nasty. They usually do what they do because of some kind of expediency, and they justify it to themselves when it's bad or when it's good. And Diocletian is coming across to me as a guy who's trying to unify all the parties. And maybe he was elected by the soldiers because somebody else thought that he was a patsy and they could control him. All right? So I'm really, I got to do a lot more study on Diocletian to know what kind of guy he really was. The point is he ends up being elevated to emperor. Okay, and if you read this article, again, this is where it's coming from, Dictionary of Christian Biography. It's now highlighted. See, it's sort of purple. and it's now underlined back and forth as I'm putting my mouse on it, that you can't see the mouse. Dictionary of Christian Biography and Literature, the end of the 6th century, with encounter principles, sects, and heresies. That's co-authored by Schaff, who was, 19th century guy, and Herzog, and I don't remember when Herzog lived. And you can download this from Calvin College, ccel.org. All right? And just read the article on Diocletian. The thing that's interesting about this article is they start to relate. It looks like it's from Eusebius, who I completely distrust. Eusebius is sometimes he's a good scholar, but a lot of times he's just an apologist. Okay, and I get really, the whole Christian fathers thing, the whole church fathers thing, a lot of that stuff is just sheer garbage, and you have to just overlook it. But the point is that he's relating a story that has a lot of detail about the fight. This is the one thing I think is true about this story. There's a huge fight going on between different factions. Okay? Diocletian was married to allegedly a Christian or Christian sympathetic. Galerius was more hostile to Christianity, and it looks like, if you read the article, I'm not sure I'm going to find it in here, but it's in here, that Galerius was basically influenced by his mother, who was really big on the pagan festivals. Okay? And so there's the whole conflict. The one thing that's good about this site at Calvin College is that it does show that there was a huge conflict with factions against Christians and pro. All right? And then it looks like Diocletian just finally caved into it. Okay? Schaff seems to think that Diocletian had a devout belief in divination. Okay, well, I find that hard to believe. Okay, because if he really did have a devout belief in divination, he would have been persecuting Christians. All right? And this whole story about, the divination wasn't working is basically what all this says. The divination wasn't working, and the so-called oracle at Delphi, which is really Satan, that's always been Satan's hangout, ended up saying that, well, it's because you've got Christians in your midst, you got to get rid of them, otherwise I'm not going to give you a good oracle, one that you can use. All right? So it's basically an ultimatum, all right, to Diocletian. So was Diocletian really having a devout belief in divination, or was he trying to position himself midway between the two and keep the unity? I opt for that idea. All right? But they're basically pushing him to choose one or the other. All right? And this whole article is basically saying, well, Diocletian was kind of trying to stop them from really persecuting the Christians that much, and then he finally gives in. All right? And then how bad it got. All right? But understand that this story is being told from a lot of sources in Eusebius and, the so-called Christian fathers. So you got, they always pad their stories. If somebody was a little bit negative to Christ, or wishy-washy to Christ, then he's demonized. If someone was a little bit favorable to Christ, like Constantine seems to have been a little bit favorable, then they deify him. It's really disgusting to have to read this kind of stuff, so you got to look at first the people who liked the Christians and then the people who disliked them, and hopefully the truth is somewhere in the middle and you can figure out what it is. So here's my sense of this story with Diocletian. Just like Paul is saying, because Paul is not talking about persecution here, all right? Just like Paul is saying with his text, and now my mouse has gone into a hang, okay? Just like Paul is saying here, there's an attempt to unify and present that God is working everything out, tuta panta and aguntas. There's an attempt to unify, and that's, of course, what God is really doing. There's an attempt to unify the empire, and, of course, with that attempt to unify is going to come conflict, especially if you've got two sides that are violently opposed to each other, and they will be violently opposed to each other if there are a lot of Christians. All right, so this was like a turning point in history because there were so many Christians versus so many pagans, and there was obviously, it had reached a sort of political issue. Okay? And that would account for why the Catholic Church politicized as an attempt in self-defense. And I think that's the heart of the story. Exactly who did what, when, and how bad it was, I can't really say. But Paul is basically talking about a unification going on here. And he's saying that Christianity is involved in that unification, and he's also saying that Christianity is apostate, which is what this 49 means at the end of verse 11. So the only one voting by the end of verse 12 is God. So he's saying it's a bad time. And Christians are not loyal to God during this time. Yeah, well, if they're busy trying to politicize, they're not loyal. But you can understand why they try to. See, you can't just demonize the Catholic Church either. They're between a rock and a hard place. If all this stuff was going on, with Diocletian and different parties like Galerius, who obviously was hung up with his mother was pushing him, you got all that going on, then you can understand why the Christians would seek to go, like the Jews did when they went to Egypt. All right? The Jews weren't going to God when they had their conflicts. They went to Egypt. That's the big theme in Isaiah 35 and 28 and, and all those chapters up through 40, is that the Jews were kind of looking to earthly leaders rather than God. Okay, well, that's what Christianity did too. And the thing that's really remarkable about this time, all right, is that this is for about 490 years after Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And one of the things that's going to distinguish Constantine is he wanted to rebuild the temple. Okay? So there is a game being played by Satan during this period, no doubt in my mind about that. Okay? And he's trying to foster a political polarization so he can kill Christians. And then if he can't succeed in killing Christians, he's going to make them take political power and therefore be so apostate, God's going to need to kill Christians, which of course happens. And it all happens right in here on the right hand side of the screen, going through here. This is when our boy Diocletian has his stroke or whatever it is, and he just plain wants to quit. That argues to me that Diocletian was really like between both parties. That his big goal was to unify, and when his dream wasn't realized, he caved in to what seemed to be the higher of the two parties, which was headed by Galerius, which is really headed by his mother. And if you remember what I showed in previous episodes, that Paul had taken... Oh, my mouse is locking up. That Paul had taken 252 as the turning point. I'm showing you the verse in Greek. You can't see it in English, and you can't see anything else because my mouse is locked up. Of course, Paul is trying to explain from the 252 period. Now my mouse is finally less. Let me just... Right here is where Paul had started talking about pregnancy. And of course my mouse is locking up so you can't see the page that well. This is where Paul was using keywords like mysterion. I can't get the mouse to work. This whole period right in here is where he was talking about the women. Okay, and it keeps on going, the problem with the women behind the throne. And it looks like it was a problem still with the women, whether it was the women behind Diocletian or the women that they each married off. Maximian married off his daughters to the two Caesars, and then Diocletian had his daughter marry off to Galenius. Both of those guys had to repudiate their current wives in order to marry the new ones. And so it's all about the women and trying to ensure inheritance. That was the theme of this period. This is when Diocletian comes to power. That's the whole theme of the period, trying to unify and get an inheritance plan going. And I had covered that in the previous, 11Q video. All right? Meanwhile, as the outgrowth of this is all this war with the Christians. That's what's really driving the period. Okay, and Diocletian to me looks like he was just trying to get everybody to get along. And he finally got so disgusted with it, he quit. And, you know, I might revise this later, but I got to have a stopping point to get to Constantine. That's where I'm at with it now. I'm going to be buying some more biographies of Galerius and Diocletian, which are new biographies you can get at Amazon. One of them is written by one of the guys at that www.romanemperors.org. He wrote the bio on Diocletian, and then there's a guy named Stephen Williams who wrote a bio on Galerius. Ooh, it sounds like it's going to be interesting, or else I got the two authors mixed up. It's vice versa, maybe. But that's the kind of stuff you got to do. You got to do more research on this, because the older historians are either pro-Christian or anti-Christian, and so you're getting a skewed story. And hopefully these new biographies will be less skewed. All right? And that way you'll understand what Paul's talking about here. And yes, you do have to go through these emperors to understand it. This is a pivotal period in history. It's driven by the women. It's driven by the growth of Christianity in both East and West. And at the same time, you got pressure during this time because Tiridates, who was in the south, you know, Persian area, he converted to Christianity too. Okay, so now we got, as it were, Rome's regarding its southern enemy, who has always been in that area, as a threat. And that could have decided Diocletian also. And then he just suddenly gives up, says, I'm not having this anymore. He got sick, he gives up, who knows what, you know, religious beliefs he had at the end. And he doesn't want any part of empire anymore. That's really significant to me. And I can't account for it right now. Suffice it to say that the battle here that Paul's talking about is the battle of preserving Christianity at all, because Christians were apostate, and so that's why their churches could be attacked, and that's why their texts could be attacked. And if it weren't for God delivering Christianity, and yeah, he used the Roman Catholic Church to do it, no doubt about that. If it wasn't for God delivering Christianity, we wouldn't have a Bible. Okay? That's how severe it was, and that's what Paul is using 49. So, you know, I'm sorry that this was such a, you know, what do you want to call it, a wandering discourse on Diocletian, but that's the way I understand it now, and if I make a radical change in how I see it, I'll do more videos later. But in the next video, in 11S, I'm going to go just straight to Constantine and just go from there, because this is a muddle. And all I know is that that the real story that you can tell is that there was a big fight going on between the growing Christian faith and the old pagan faith, and that's what finally turned the tables and made Diocletian quit and made Constantine rise to the fore, even though the main, what do you want to call it, denomination or, you know, power of Christianity at this time was Roman Catholic, and yes, it's apostate, but they all were. God still used it to save the Bible from destruction. Next time.